or whatever appropriate time of the day it is for you. I want to begin with just thanks, an expression of gratitude for My Jewish Learning for convening this space. And I see that, we're 200 plus strong right now in this space, and it's a powerful place for me to be, and a powerful place I hope for you to be as well. I know for me, the virtual space that My Jewish Learning convened was important for me as we navigated through the pandemic, and has also been an important space as we navigated through the last year. As Jews, we create community in so many ways. And the fact that we have new tools and new ways to come together make it important for us to be innovative and creative. And I've drawn a lot of strength from this virtual community, and I'm pleased to be here today for part of the way that I mark this day. I want to begin sort of with that question: how is it that we think we should mark this day? And to echo my friend and colleague, Rabbi Kelson, to say there are ways we're not sure. I remember a decade and a half ago on thinking about how to first commemorate the first 9/11 here in America where I live. Well, the world had changed a lot. We hadn't totally felt a year later all the ways in which the world would change, but there was enough distance from the original day to be able to start to develop commemorations and ceremonies, gatherings to help provide comfort and meaning to those who had been through the day and its impact, no matter how close or how far you were from the epicenter of that day. I think for us, what's different on this October 7th, 2024, is that while it's a year later, as so many people have noted, the conflict is ongoing. We're not quite in a place to commemorate or remember. We don't yet know how this moment in time, as expanded as it is, will end. We don't know what it will be like yet to look back upon this time as something of the past and think about what it means to us and how we moved on and what came out of it. And it makes this day something of a dilemma. I've been in many conversations with colleagues thinking about how to mark this in their communities and their synagogues and other spaces. And I've heard many voices of people to say, we're not yet in a place where we can tie this up neatly. We're not yet in a place where the essays and the poetry and the memes and the learning and vigils and the protests and ceremonies can give us full comfort, because we haven't emerged yet from this. And some of that is messy. And that led me to think of the Mishnayot that in a moment we're going to turn to think about. I'm going to share some Mishnayot from the last chapter of Masechet Brachot, which talks in part about some of the blessings we say on different occasions. Before we turn to that text, though, just a word about blessings. We often, when we say the word blessings in English, think about blessing each other. You give a blessing to somebody else. And Judaism has that too. We have examples in the Bible of biblical characters giving blessings to other biblical characters. And sometimes a blessing is something that one gives to someone else, right? We bless our children every Shabbat at the dinner table. There are other moments where we give blessings to one another. Ritually, though, most blessings that we say in Judaism, the entity that we're blessing is not another person, and not even the ritual that the blessing accompanies. But when we say blessings, we're blessing God. We take certain moments ritually, ritual moments, celebratory moments, moments on our calendar, and we take those as opportunities to bless God for one reason or another. And we're going to look at a series of Mishnayot and a few examples of blessings that the rabbis note that happen at particular times. And the Mishnayot talk about the blessing that's appropriate for us to say about God in those moments. And on one hand, while I hope that these Mishnayot have what to say to us on this October 7th as one rabbinic response that might help us, I also recognize that some of these ideas that the rabbis have to say in these Mishnayot might be challenging for us on this day. Not challenging to understand, but challenging in that they might not be a comfortable or natural go-to place for us. And I think there's a lesson to think about in exploring what the rabbis have to say about, even though we might not go there on our own, is the theology that they present in these Mishnayot something that we might help us. And I acknowledge both the messy times that we're in and the messiness of the theology that is contained in these texts that I'm going to share in a minute. Might be helpful and might not be at all helpful to us on this difficult day. I wanted to say that from the outset. I'm gonna place in the chat a link to the Google slides that I've prepared. I'm going to share them on my screen in a moment. You can follow along on the screen, but I know sometimes in this space, some people like to follow along separately or even to look at them later on. So I put the link in the chat. Should be okay. All right. With that introduction, I'm going to share my screen and we'll begin to look at these particular texts. All right. And I see some of you, I see the link is working because some of you have found your way into them. Appreciate that. Okay. So I want to start with it's all these Mishnayot come from chapter 9 of Masachet Brachot, the last chapter of this Masachet. And I'm looking at selections from individual Mishnayot. So this text comes from Mishnah 2, although it's not the entire Mishnah 2. And here the rabbis make the following statement: for rain and for other good news. Rain, of course, especially in Israel, where the rabbis who put this text together were, there was no better news than rain because of the dry climate that's there. But when it rained, or other good news, one says the blessing, Baruch HaTov u'meitiv, blessed is the one that is good and grants good. And in fact, if you were to say this ritually, you would say the entire formula, right? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam HaTov u'meitiv. The Mishnah gives it to us here in the shorthand. And for bad news, the Mishnah gives us another bracha, Baruch Dayan Haemet, blessed be the true judge. The rabbis acknowledge by giving us these two brachot that often the tidings that we hear are good and often the tidings that we hear are bad. And both occasions are ones that merit a blessing. When we hear good news, we say a blessing and we bless God for being the embodiment of good and for granting good to us on the occasion of hearing something good. When we hear news that is bad, we say a blessing that it acknowledges God for being the true judge, or even Dayan Haemet, you could translate, it's often translated as the true judge, but that God is the judge of truth, or somehow in judgment, right? God judges the truth, God brings the truth. There's an echo of that here as well. That latter bracha is most commonly said when you hear news that someone has passed away. When you hear the news of a death, this is the bracha you're supposed to say ritually. But here in the Mishnah, it's not only brought in the context of hearing of someone's death, but it's about any bad tidings. So I want to start here with this theological frame. The rabbis, of course, want us to think about saying brachot and Masachet Brachot in the Talmud. It suggests that a full day includes 100 different blessings, and there are many moments where we might say a blessing, both liturgically or ritually. These two blessings are not about a particular ritual, a particular celebration, but just about hearing tidings, good ones or bad ones. And the Mishnah tells us there's a bracha both for the positive and the negative, that every sort of news should be followed after you hear it by one bracha or another, one that fits the context. So we're going to come back to this theme, which will be echoed later in the chapter as we go. I want to introduce you first to these two blessings that appear in this Mishnah. Moving ahead a slide. Turning to Mishnah 3, the Mishnah teaches when one builds a new house or purchases new vessels, one recites the blessing. This is one that I imagine will be familiar to many on the call. Blessed be the one who has given us life, sustained us, and brought us to this time. Right? We call this shorthand from the Hebrew the Shechianu. Right? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Shechianu v'kimanu v'gianu lezman hazeh. That's the full bracha. In the Mishnah, and right shorthand, we often just call it the Shechianu. And the Mishnah lists two examples when you build a new house or you purchase new vessels. When you do something new, or acquire something new and use it, this is the blessing that we say. We know we say this at many momentous events. It's a blessing that we say to accompany the happiness that we have life and we've been sustained and we brought to this time. But immediately following this announcement of this blessing and one of its purposes, the Mishnah says, "Mevarech al hara'ah me'ein hatova ve'al tova me'ein hara'ah." I'll acknowledge from the outset that there's a complicated Hebrew phrase, and the commentators have many different ways to interpret it. I'm going to stick with one theme, although if you study this Mishnah more in depth, you'll see there are other ways to read this line. There's a way in which the Hebrew isn't fully clear. But one line that the commentators take is to say, right, one recites a blessing for the bad that befalls them just as one does for the good, and one recites a blessing for the good that befalls them just as one does for the bad, echoing what we saw in Mishnah 2 before. And it read this way right after the Shechianu. It raises the question for me. Right, in our practice in this day, the Shechianu is reserved for those happy occasions. But I wonder, given what we saw in Mishnah 2, that there's a blessing for good news and a blessing for bad news, that perhaps in this statement also that the Shechianu, which says, blesses God, who's the power that gives us life, sustains us, and brought us to this time. While we say this blessing in positive moments, one way to read the Mishnah is to say that this is a blessing that's meant to be said both in the positive moments and at the difficult moments. That we're praising God at the positive moments for sustaining us, bringing us to this time, right, having life and being able to celebrate being there. But there's also something to note at a difficult moment to feel that God has sustained us and brought us through the difficult time. Read this way, in some ways it's problematic. I can't think of in the moment, taking a different contemporary example of those who just experienced the hurricane in North Carolina and the surrounding areas, and they're embracing the devastation. Maybe they want to Baruch Dayan might fit, and that the Shechianu doesn't feel right for that space. But one piece that the rabbis might be emphasizing here is that just as you say a bracha, just as the Shechianu say a bracha for being sustained through the positive, maybe we ought to say one too at the negative moments. And that has to do in part with the rabbi's sense of that there's one God, and the notion of one God, the monotheism of Judaism, means that God has something to do with everything that happens, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And that theologically, I would say, while emotionally we might react differently to the positive than the negative, theologically we might want to stay more even. And while our emotional response to one event or another might be different, and maybe even if we go with the blessings mentioned before from Mishnah 2, the language of our liturgical response might be different. As I studied these texts preparing for today, seeing in this Mishnah the possibility that one way to read this is to say, maybe even that Shechianu bracha is not just reserved for one side of our experience, but for all sides of the experience, and that any significant moment that accompanies whether joy or hardship or change or something new, for good or for bad, we should note God's presence and say a blessing that invokes God and God's involvement in the world, regardless of how the outcome impacts us or our community or the world at large. That's Mishnah number 3 here. On that, what follows that in the Mishnah, though, is something that says, encourages us to think about exactly what it is our language that we say in particular moments. And here's the Mishnah shifts from language, specifically the language of bracha, that we're blessing, right, where we bless God, but it's a moment of prayer where we call out to God. The Mishnah warns us that in a moment of peril, in a moment of trouble, we ought to think carefully about what language we use when we reach out and we say blessings. And it provides 2 classic examples here. So the Mishnah says, one who cries out over the past, this is a vain prayer. The important piece here is, right, when we cry out over something that has happened, it's already happened. The experience is there. We have to be careful about how we cry out so that we don't pray in vain. What do they mean by that? Well, the Mishnah asks, how so? And it answers its own question and brings 2 examples. If one's wife is pregnant and one says, may it be God's will that my wife bear a son, this is a vain prayer, right? Notice the language here. Your partner is pregnant, so the pregnancy has already happened. The rabbis knew, as we know, once someone is pregnant, it's already been determined if the child will be male or female. So once the pregnancy has happened, a prayer to have a son or a prayer to have a daughter is a prayer that's in vain, since it's already been determined what the biological gender of what the biological sex of the child will be. And to say a prayer asking for one son as opposed to a daughter, or daughter as opposed to a son, it's past time. It's the wrong time to say that prayer because it's happened. Second example is similar, deals with not family expansion, but a calamity, right? If one is traveling home from a journey, one is on the road, one hears a cry of distress in the town up ahead. Right, what's the vain prayer? If someone calls out and says, may it be God's will that the cry is not from those of my household. The Mishnah reminds us this would be a vain prayer. Or once the cry of distress has gone out, whatever household it's been from has already been determined. And if the cry is from your household, that's already happened. And so the Mishnah warns us, don't call out in that moment of distress to hope, to pray for that you and the people you know have been spared the calamity, because that is not something to pray for anymore once the event has happened in itself. And that says in both of these cases, right, both for the good and the challenging, for which there's a bracha, if there's a prayer to accompany it, the rabbis in the Mishnah warn us, think carefully about your words, because while God might be part of both the positive and the negative that happened in the world, while God might be part of the good tidings or the negative tidings, once events have happened, once they've come into our reality, it's not within God's power to go back and change them. God doesn't intervene in the past. And so if we're going to pray, could be a prayer for the present or maybe the future, but not the past. And selecting our language carefully keeps us from making our prayers in these moments a vain prayer, a useless prayer, a tefillat shav, something to think about what language that we choose. Moving ahead to Mishnah 5, the Mishnah returns to a theme that it mentioned before, that I quoted as well, and here uses a little different language, but says again, one must bless God for the bad in the same way that one blesses God for the good, and brings us a source for why this is true, and it's a source that's I think familiar to many of us here on this call, from the words of the Shema and following the opening line, the opening paragraph of the Shema, the Ve'ahavta we sometimes call it. But you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. The rabbis use this as a source in many different contexts, and they ask, like, what does it mean to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might? Here, the Mishnah quotes the full midrash explaining all three. It's going to be the third, with all your might, that answers that explains what it means to bless God in the for the bad, the same as one does with the good. But I'll go through the whole midrash until we get to that moment in the end. With all your heart, says the midrash. What does it mean to love God with all your heart? Meaning with your two impulses, your bad impulse, your good impulse, right? Yetzer hatov and Yetzer hara in Hebrew, right? Your good inclination, your evil inclination. It's sometimes translated. This goes to say, right? The rabbis sometimes thought in dualities that, right, there's good and evil, and while they see God as part of both, right, good tidings and bad tidings, they see within each of us that struggle as well. That we have an inclination to do good, we have an inclination to do bad, and each of those are part of who we are. The commandment to love God, says this midrash, isn't just a commandment for your Yetzer Hatov, your good impulse, but both your good impulse and your evil impulse should both strive to. You should strive to use them out of expression of love for God, and that's what it means. Love God with all your heart, not just one side. Second, what does it mean to love God with all your soul? B'chol nafshecha. The midrash says here, even though God takes your soul, could mean your life, away from you. Even at difficult moments, even though, right, our life is limited, even though your soul won't be with you at all times, even in the moments when your life is departing from you, you should still, you should still love God. In other places, the rabbis tell stories about their colleagues who are on their deathbeds, who express expressions of this, both in moments of good and in moments of evil, in terms of how it is that their life is ending. But even at those moments, the mitzvah, the commandment to love God, still applies. The third, b'chol me'odecha, with all your might, we often translate it in English. One rabbinic understanding of what me'odecha is, like with all of your might, meaning with all of your resources. And sometimes they mean that literally, where you should love God with your resources, meaning the money that you have. That's one explanation, but it's the second explanation that comes back to the theme of this chapter, these Mishnayot here in Masechet Brachot. How do we love God with all of our might? Well, what does that mean? Whatever measure God metes out to you, you must thank God with all of your might. Meaning, whatever it is that you get from God, whether it be positive or negative, good tidings or bad tidings, good experience, negative experience, that the mitzvah to love God with all of your might means you have to use all of your strength, all of your might, to get through whatever is you're experiencing and maintain your love of God through those difficult times. And that's the last passage from the Mishnah here we're going to look at. I'm going to I'm trying to stop sharing. Oh, there we go. There we go. And I'm back to you. I want to pull this all together a little bit, and first just echo something I said at the beginning. I think the theology the rabbis present here and their use of brachot can be messy, and in that sense, it speaks to me and what I'm feeling on the messiness, the complexity of this day. I think in some ways, on a day like October 7th, 2024, where I'm thinking a lot about October 7th, 2023, think about a verse from the book of Jeremiah, where the prophet Jeremiah says we should seek out God when God is close. I'm reminded of the Israeli poet's Yehuda Amichai's comment on that verse, where he says, "But God feels so far." That Jeremiah says, seek out God when God is close, and on some days, at some periods, at some times in our lives, in some eras, we feel God's distance. And on days like October 7th, 2023 and 2024, and I bet on 2025 and 2026, and for many into the future, there's a way to feel the absence of God on this day and what it felt like to feel God's distance. And that's a normal human response. It's part of the struggle that we have. The rabbis had in ancient times and we have in modern times. It's a theological challenge we face. How do we account for evil in the world? How do we account for God's presence when God feels unable to stop any kind of calamity, whether caused by humans or by nature, and to protect us from it? When we feel weak and feeble and we feel God's absence, sometimes we wallow in that, and that can be helpful to us. But I thought about these Mishnayot here in Masechet Brachot, where the rabbis challenge us to think about God and invoke God's presence, both in the good times and the bad times. Because the rabbis felt strongly, God is not only Hatov Al-Maitiv. God is not only the bringer of good. God is also Dayan Emet. God is also the power that forces us to face reality and to see the truth of what's happened. The rabbis challenge us to bless God, not just at happy moments when we get good news, but challenge us to bless God even in the difficult moments when we get bad news, and not just the smallest of bad news, but the strongest of bad news. And so on this day, when we feel perhaps God's absence, I'm thinking a lot about the rabbinic challenge contained in these Mishnayot that asks us to overcome that absence and to, like the Midrash at the end says, to use all of our strength, all of our might, b'chol me'odecha, and to get through the challenging feelings and thoughts and beliefs that we're carrying with us in our hearts and in our minds, and find a way to vocalize the words of blessing and to invoke God's presence, even at these tough times. And I hope in hearing the rabbi's challenge, well, on one hand, if it's something that you can lean into to help you on this tough day, that you use it that way. If it's something that adds to the messiness of the day, I'm right there with you. And if it's something that you say, nope, not for me, I think that's one of the beautiful things about today, that there's a whole series of teachers coming to teach today with different words of Torah. And I'm sure you'll hear different messages from each of my colleagues who are joining us on the call, on the Zoom. And I hope that in some of our voices, each and every one of you take away something that helps you get through these challenging times.